the numbers of medium-sized manufacturing firms looking at their owners and the extent to which they had succession plans, and more than half of them do not, right? And so this, even as you talk about wealth generation and generational wealth rather, what are the ways in which we can build on businesses that we do have to make sure that there's succession in place, so those kinds of things continue. So I think that's one way, right, that we can not necessarily just address the issue of retirees, but the families that can have the potential to be successors for what they've created.
Hi, good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. My name is Sylvia. I work for the Illinois Department of Public Health. And Sylvia, your comments around how health is not in the scope of this report, but it's important to mention, especially when we're talking about Latinos, given the fact that COVID kind of messed a lot of things up for many different groups, I wondered if this group could make hypotheses around what Latinos in the suburbs can face post-COVID, quote unquote. What they're experiencing and how we can kind of meet those challenges
Well,
yeah.
I'm going to refer you to my colleague back there, Alejandra Ibanez, who runs Illinois Unidos, who is precisely looking at that question. Illinois Unidos is a statewide coalition that's looking to address and impact the long-term implications of COVID on the Latino community.
Before we go to Bobby, I want to just make a comment real quickly on your question. I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't impart some of what's been shared with me by a young scholar that's affiliated with us, Jose Acosta, who's also an organizer, who makes the point that there's a connection also between where we settle and our proximity to industrial locations, and the extent to which there is pollution and therefore health impacts from that proximity. And so a lot of his work has been in the cities around Little Village, for example, but he's been making that point as it relates to our suburban settlement patterns as well. And so we're going to be getting into that in some subsequent reports, but looking at that relationship between where we settle and our proximity to industrial locations. That's a report that he's working on. And I think that contributes to our health, because we know, for example, there is data showing that we have higher rates of asthma and other respiratory illnesses that are associated with our proximity to industrial locations and polluting facilities.
And there's one up there too. So,
I'm Victor Ortiz, and I'd like to bring the discussion back to the concept of paradox. It's being used to highlight the contradiction. How is it that in some ways things are improving and in others they are not? And I think that in that respect, the term is very useful. At the same time, I fear that it might hide something that needs urgent attention, and that is, and it's been pointed out by the panelists, about the need for action. And what I understood is that, or what I fear, is that if we hear about paradox, we assume that things are the way they are. That, well, it goes that way and it also goes that way. I think that we need to slow down and realize that things don't happen. They are made to happen. And I think that this great data help us venture into new terrain, to envision options, to envision actions. And my feeling is that if we think about home ownership, for example, we need to sort of slow down and think that maybe it is so. Yet, I think that in more pointed ways, home ownership has been declining for all the groups. And I think that we really need to get this information very clearly in our minds, but then immediately think about relationships. Because it's not just what happens with Latinos, it's what's happening with everybody else. Teresa Córdova mentions that since the 80s, the povertization of the suburbs has been recognized. That doesn't happen just because the poor decided to move to the suburbs. It happens because of gentrification and the new industrial arrangement of jobs and so forth. But gentrification is extremely important. And it's not happening just because 1980 happened and they say gentrification's time is on. It's because there were very concrete interests that made it happen so. So I think that the main value for this report is to really go and see where we can push the needle into more precise recognition of areas of intervention. And just very briefly, I'm working on education. I disagree with the term acculturation. I think it confuses more than it elucidates. But socialization, I think, is a more better term. And what I'm seeing now, before, kids would not go to the same schools, right? In my case, what I'm studying, kids are going to the same school, people of color with whites. However, the attention that those students get in the same school building is quite different. And it doesn't stop just at the school level. The state has just passed a college and career pathways program that aims to, surprise, surprise, improve the working population, the employees for the state. However, it's done with a very little attention to the discrepant competence level of students, which means, surprise, surprise, people of color are gonna go and work with the low-paying jobs, and other students are gonna go with the good jobs.
I don't want to cut you off, but do you have a question for the panel? I know there's still a couple people who have a few questions, and we want to get to them before we close.
Thank you. So the question here is, how can we push this beyond the, well, it should happen, but instead, how is it made happen, and how can we counter that? Thank you.
So we'll close with that, but can we make this the last question, I think, Marybel?
Okay.
It'll be quick. It's a question. Roberto Sepulveda, community member. In 2010, there was a report also published, Strength and Unity, focused on proviso. I think Sylvia, I think you were a part of that. And in today, and briefly seeing today's report, I don't see much progress in those communities, and it's 14 years later. My question is, can we put these reports side to side and evaluate what has been done and see what are not the solutions and present them? And just an idea, I think you do a great job with your Latino policy cohort program. Maybe it's a working document that can be worked on by some of these cohorts, but I just am a little bit disappointed in 14 years afterwards, I don't see much progress in some of these communities.
Well, we have seen some progress, but we have not seen enough. And to the point, I think, of the point that Victor was making, and maybe just to close, right, we deliberately did not put policy recommendations in this report because there's so much here that we really need to reflect on and figure out how to best move forward, right? Our idea and our intention is, as community members, as policymakers, as elected officials, as stakeholders, there's something here for all of us to work on, whether it's the educational, the housing piece, the integration piece, and the intersectionality of all of that. Sure, I mean, I think we could look at, what's been done in Cicero, Berwyn, and Maywood, and look at those things, but we are just at the beginning stages, I think, of beginning to think about what a policy agenda is that addresses this. It's challenging and complicated, and many of you in the room know this, because every municipality is its own political entity. And there has been very little in various municipalities working together, right, versus working just individually. So it's also very challenging, just given the political nature of our political districts in Illinois, whether they're municipal or at other levels, right, because there has not been historically a lot of cooperation and working together. But I think, you know, the call to action for all of us is, as you read and reflect on this report, what can you each do in the communities that you work in the area that you work on, so that we can have this broader collective impact. And we, our organizations and institutions, will be thinking about that as well, and be coming back at a later date with how do we really identify what are some of the direct policy things that we can be working on to address what we've highlighted in this report.
And on that note, you all have access to the QR code where you can view the report and you can read it in detail there. Thank you, everybody who joined us today, whether that was in person or virtually. Thank you to our hosts, the Latino Policy Forum and its partners, the Metropolitan Planning Council, and UIC's Great Cities Institute. And thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. We really do appreciate it. Have a good night.